Hello everybody, good evening. Please make yourself comfortable. I think the language will be English today, I guess. And it's our pleasure, mine and Maria's, to welcome you at the Embassy of the Republic of Armenia on Armenia's soil. You're not in Canada, you're in Armenia, legally speaking. But Aram will take us to the very interesting journey, I would say, and of course he will tell us. And at first, to me, and I'm not an expert and I don't want to pretend, but I'm a diplomat who was preoccupied and still occupied with the issue of Armenian genocide, but also other global issues of violation of human rights. And today's aspect is, of course, in my opinion, is research, study, and education, which the Centennial Committee of Canada has commissioned, has asked, actually not commissioned, has asked Aram to do for us. And at first, to me, as a historian and as a diplomat who was dealing with this issue for years, was all right. We had so many books about call from Armenia and reaction in media in the United States, in Russia, in France, throughout the world, everywhere. What else can we find, right? And of course, when I was going through the book, it was incredibly fascinating story and journey. What has happened before, actually, when during the Armenian genocidal massacres? What was the reaction of Canada? What was not only media's reaction, but people's fundraisings, efforts, and not only during the genocide, but also after the genocide. So to me, this subject is incredibly interesting. And I would like you to have more time with Aram, of course. Thank you all for coming. And I would like to ask Sasun, Hovanesian Consul of the Embassy, to read a little bio about Aram Adjemian. Please, Sasun.
Good evening. I want to present to you today's speaker, Aram Adjemian. Aram is an independent researcher who has a bachelor degree in political science with a minor in philosophy and a master's degree in history with a specialization in genocide and human rights studies from Concordia University. His book, Call from Armenia, Canada's Response to the Armenian Genocide, is a reworked, enhanced, and illustrated version of his 2007 master's thesis. He has been a parliamentary research assistant for Senator Serge Joyal since 2008. Originally from Montreal, he moved to Ottawa in 2005, where he lives with his wife and their 3 young children. Since 2008, he has been active in the Ottawa Armenian community as a reporter for the Armenian TV program, taught for a year in the Saturday Armenian School part-time, and he belongs to a Turkish-Kurdish-Armenian dialogue group that was formed soon after journalist Hrant Dink's assassination. Welcome, Aram.
Thank you everyone for being here. It's really nice to be able to present this book in Ottawa. I've presented it so far in Montreal, Toronto and Cambridge and Vancouver, and on Parliament Hill, and to parliamentarians in the BC legislature as well on April 24th. So thank you very much for everyone for being here. I'd like to say a big thank you to the ambassador, his staff, his wife for welcoming me and for putting this together today. As well as the Centennial Committee for, they didn't commission, indeed, they did ask me, but otherwise this book would not be here. But especially the book wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the Pastor Marjan Foundation. They put all the money behind the book, so a big thank you to them, and thank you to all of you for being here. I'll be speaking in English. I'll gladly take questions in 3 languages later, in French and Armenian, and if you'll indulge me, I'll just say a few words in French and Armenian. Donc, je vais parler seulement en anglais aujourd'hui, mais si vous avez des questions par la suite, vous pouvez le demander en français, je vais les traduire, puis on va traduire la réponse aussi en anglais et en français. եւ հայերենովսեմ շատ շնորհակալ որ եկաք, դժբախտաբար պիտի մինագանքներով լա այսօր ու սամսեզի համար հարց չասիգա, բայց հարցազրույցի ժամանակ վերջավորության եթե հարցում ունիք գնահ հարցնել հայերենով եւ ես կթարգմանեմ հարցումը The ambassador already gave about a quarter of my speech, so that's good. But as a refresher, my book is indeed a reworked, enhanced, and illustrated version of my master's thesis. Now, a master's thesis in and of itself, like any book, it's a bit dry and you could read it from beginning to end. But I find for the average reader, and the idea of this book is to basically educate or to give an impression to not just historians, but to the average person as well, who doesn't necessarily follow Canadian history very closely, a visual kind of aid to understand the subject at hand. As most of you here know, but perhaps not all of you, last year was the centenary of the start of the Armenian genocide, which is commemorated every year on April 24th. On April 24th in 1915, the basic way the genocide started was that intellectuals were imprisoned and most were killed thereafter. And after that, villages were basically depopulated, murdered, or deported. So the centenary last year, there were a lot of events, including the Canadian Centennial Committee wanted something like this book to be available. So I'm very happy that it's available for you. It does bring new research. Like I'd say a good quarter of the book is stuff that you wouldn't be able to find anywhere else. My purpose when I wrote this book, and I'll be speaking for about 10 minutes just to let you know from now, and then I'll be showing you a collection of slides for another 20 minutes. My whole presentation shouldn't last more than half an hour, maybe 40 minutes. So the format, as I said earlier, it's intended for a general audience. I basically, like a National Geographic magazine, I want somebody to be able to pick it up and to look through it, and just with some of the articles or pictures, to gather an idea already of what Canadians 100 years ago thought about this whole genocide issue. Of course, the word genocide didn't exist then, but they would call it mass extermination or martyred nation or something like that, but nevertheless, the intent is the same. Secondly, out of the three main purposes I have for the book, I very much want this book to be a launching pad for further research. I'm very glad that since I started presenting the book, I found out, first of all, in Toronto, there's an organization, the Corning Center. They've taken this book, they've taken segments of it, and they're using it to teach genocide education in classrooms in Toronto. So that I'm very happy about. There is a nurse who's doing his master's research in Vancouver, and he's using this research to find out about Canadian nurses who went to Armenia and who helped Armenians. We might know, or some people might have heard of Sarah Corning. She's one of the ones, she's actually not even in my book, but there are at least 4 or 5, and it would be interesting to look through archives and see their stories and what they witnessed and what they've done. These are Canadians who went abroad, and their stories should not be hidden in our archives. I'm very glad also, the third purpose of this book is to educate anybody who's willing to learn about this. So this book has been doled out to select libraries, some parliamentarians, historians, etc. So I'm very happy about that as well. I'll talk a bit about me. I work for a senator, which has been very good for at least one thing, and I'll talk about a bit later, Serge Royal. And I've been working for him for 8 years. Once upon a time, I figured I was going to be a university prof. That was kind of where I was heading. But life took a bit of a turn, and I've been working in a senator's office since then. But my MA thesis, I'm very happy that I was able to put this together and make a book out of it. I do remain one of very few people who've written about this subject. There are maybe 3 or 4 other people who are experts or researchers who actually have chosen this particular field. And because I'm not affiliated with any institution any longer, I felt the need to consult with Canadian historians of high stature, or who knew the period at least in question. So at least 3 of them who I consulted also gave testimonials which appear on the back of the book. And they are McGill's Professor Desmond Morton. He's a specialist in Canada's military history. University of Toronto's Professor Emeritus Robert Craig Brown, who's the past president of the Canadian Historical Association, and John Meehan, who's the president of Campion College at the University of Regina. He's written about Canadian Jesuit and missionary involvement abroad. And I'm very lucky that my wife's brother is very close friends with him, so I was able to approach him for that reason. I'm particularly thankful to two others who gave their testimonial at the back of the book. Filmmaker Atom Egoyan, who I'm sure everyone in this room, or likely everyone in this room has heard of, and the Rwandan UN Force Commander and former Senator Romeo Dallaire, who, as far as I knew before I approached him, I had never heard him comment on the Armenian genocide specifically. So I was very happy that he read a draft of my book and offered a testimonial for it. The book is organized in 7 chapters. The first 3 are devoted to historical context. So we are, I've looked at Canadian humanitarian campaigns that were undertaken for Armenian relief. And they also offer what I consider to be crucial context for my other chapters that I talk about post-war, Canada's response during the post-war. So chapter 1 is the 19th century, chapter 2 is during the genocide up to around 1919, and chapter 3 I've devoted only to 1920 because there was a big fundraising campaign, as you'll see, by the newspaper The Globe in 1920. My 4th to 6th chapters look at the year 1920 still, because that's the crux here. 1920 is when Canadians were particularly involved in this humanitarian campaign more than perhaps anywhere else in the world, including the US. My 4th chapter looks at a lobbying campaign that was undertaken here by Canadian churches across Canada. So they, in their churches, talked about what had happened to the Armenian people, and they would send the information to the federal government, and they wanted the federal government to do something about it, and that's what my 5th chapter is about. Any budding historians here, or people who are particularly interested in Canada's political history would be pretty interested in that chapter. My 6th one looks at, if you've ever heard about the Armenian mandate for the United States. The United States was going to take a mandate for Armenia, but it fell through. There was a brief period where Canada considered taking this mandate. Not the government, there were individuals that were interested. But that was the main thing that launched my research when I was doing my thesis in 2007. So I'm looking at the mandate issue. And my 7th chapter looks at the winding down of the issue in the following few years. So Canada's representatives at the League of Nations who talked about Armenia. There's something called the Chenak affair. I don't know if anyone here has heard about it. It was basically when Britain asked for Dominion to send soldiers to help them combat the Turkish forces. It was just prior to the establishment of the Turkish Republic, and Canada refused to join at that time. And one thing that some people here probably do know, which is the Georgetown Boys. If I say that, I'm sure I'll get a lot of nods here. The Georgetown Boys, who were orphans who were brought to Canada, 150, mostly boys, some girls, and established a farm in Georgetown, Ontario for the most part. So that's how my book is organized. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go show you some illustrations, and I'm going to go basically chapter by chapter to show you, again, I didn't want this to be too wordy. I don't want to get too much into the details. Whoever's interested, please take the book and read it cover to cover. But otherwise, what I really wanted to do is I found so much material on this issue that just the visual material was enough to already fill several 100 pages of the book. So, starting with that, we'll start with how Canadians heard about the Armenian people in the first place. Missionaries from Canada traveled to the Ottoman Empire. I've personally seen maybe about 15 or so. I've seen other researchers, in all about 50 Canadians went abroad and saw more or less the living conditions of these people. They wanted to proselytize, to get the Turks and Kurds to convert, who were very bad converts. The Armenians were great converts to Protestantism. So these two gentlemen, brothers here, Robert and William Chambers, lived in Armenia their whole lives. They traveled there in 1879. They were there until their deaths. Their families were born there. They all spoke Armenian. Their whole families spent time there, and then they came back, as did many Canadian missionaries. They the way this worked is that these people are indicative particularly of what some of these missionaries did. They would write letters to people in Canada. For example, they were from Queen's University, and at the time there was Queen's principal George Monroe Grant, a very well-known intellectual, Canadian intellectual at the time. And George Grant would read these letters and he would send them to the Globe or to other newspapers that had, again, these Protestant affiliations, and they would publish what was happening at the time. Now, in the 1880s, I found evidence of 6 separate fundraising efforts in Canada. And the first one was in 1880. A couple of months after they went there was an earthquake in Van. And after the earthquake, they collected a couple of $100 in the Globe and in, I think it was called the Canada Presbyterian, another one of many, many religious periodicals of the time that I haven't gone through all, and I'm sure there's a lot more information in any of these. So again, if anybody does further research on these, I'm sure there's a lot of interesting tidbits of information in there. So the Chambers brothers, and William in particular, explained how they weren't particularly flattering towards the Armenian people, not at this time anyway. And the fundraising at this time was for everyone that lived in this area. Things changed after. As the ambassador mentioned earlier, and perhaps some of you don't know, about 20 years before the genocide, there was a very large-scale genocidal massacre of Armenians, of about 200,000 Armenians. They're called, usually referred to as the Hamidian massacres. The Sultan at the time, Hamid, basically wanted to silence dissent, and as a result, something like 200,000 Armenians were killed. So these missionaries, William, in fact, and his nephew, Robert's son, they had a girls' college where they saved the lives of many Armenians there because they were students. So they were eyewitnesses to everything that happened. I was surprised that in 1895 to find so much information in Canadian newspapers, of which you'll see a few right now, a bit of information. That's William when he's older and his wife Cornelia. Frederick McCallum, another missionary, I'll get back to him, he's super interesting. One of the brothers, the first picture that we saw earlier, one of them, I'm not sure which one is Jack, is the one who's writing this letter. He, in 1896, wrote a letter. I found this in a little archive in, I think it's called Wellington, a town in Ontario where they're from. Is writing to suggest to, I think it's Robert, who's writing to his brother, saying maybe we should bring Armenians to Canada and establish them in the Canadian West, in the prairies, and settle them there. They're hardy, hardworking people, etc., etc. And in fact, 6 times, I believe, before those Georgetown boys, who you may have heard about, have there been calls for Armenians to be settled in Canada, and they were basically rejected, as a lot of other peoples were. Generally, Canadians preferred North European stock as a general rule. Yes, where were we? 1895, an example of a couple of pictures that appeared in the newspapers. This is taken from a photograph that was published in a London newspaper. It says, "The massacre at Erzurum, bodies of murdered Armenians in the cemetery awaiting burial." I'm not sure why they didn't publish the picture. It's possible that they considered it too graphic, but whoever it was illustrated from the original picture, which is available on Wikipedia. 1895, Canadian missionary who was tortured and beaten by Ottoman forces at the time and imprisoned. This is a Protestant church that was burned with, I think, 600 people inside, and etc. So we have, I just selected, I had hundreds of articles from this time. I selected a couple of pictures just to give a general idea of what's happening. I'm going to come back to this this Protestant church later on when I'm going to talk about chapter 7. Just keep it in mind. One of the better-known Canadian editors, illustrators, and people who, some people even claim that he was partly responsible for the downfall of John A. Macdonald because of his newspaper Grip. His name is Bengao, John Bengao, I believe it is. Sorry, I forget his first name. He wrote, he did this kind of illustration. that were published in various newspapers. So this is the phrenology chart of the head of the country. This is John A. Macdonald and his head, and basically did caricatures. And I found 4 caricatures from the 1890s by this gentleman, and several poems in 1920 that he wrote. So again, to give you an idea of the high-profile people who were interested in this particular case. When I was saying earlier that there were magazines, again in the 1890s, this is an example of one of them. The Methodist Magazine and Review had a 10 or 20, I can't remember, page article on what was happening to the Armenian people and Canada's specific interest and involvement in it. I also found a book specifically published in Canada. Now, such books exist for other places. There are a lot of such American books about their involvement in Armenians. There were a lot of Americans who went abroad as missionaries. But it's good to have this information of particularly Canadian information. So the Sword of Islam was basically similar to an American book that existed, but this one in particular was published in Brantford in Toronto. It gave the same information, but had one chapter in particular on the attitude of Canada. Both of those magazine articles are in the book. So if anybody gets the book later on, which I'm sure you all will, right? But, the first half of the book, it's about 250 pages. The written part is about 110 pages or so. The rest are archival material near the end. And throughout, it's peppered with pictures and other stuff. So, anyway, so if you're interested, you can read it. So what these missionaries did was, when they were writing about what was happening to the Armenians back then, they already knew basically who the Armenian people were, Canadians. They were well versed with them. So when the genocide happened, Canada was at war, as you know. The United States was not at war until 1917. So they actually had missionaries still in Armenia, I guess let's call it, in Armenia, and they were witnesses to the genocide. There were not too many Canadians because they were not there during the war. However, there were some who fell through the cracks and they were eyewitnesses, and we have some of their information as well. My second chapter, I look at, well, this is 1909. Now, earlier I said there were 6 fundraising efforts. 1880, I told you about the first one. 1896, where about 30,000 was collected. 1909, there was what's called isolated murder of about 30,000 Armenians in the region of Marash. Then there was, during the genocide, there was no fundraising effort that I found. Actually, during the genocide, which is kind of funny, yeah, you might think, but it's during the war, and I guess it just took a while. Fundraising efforts started in 1916, and the big one is in 1920, and then there was one in 1923 or so. So during 1909, again, there was information about massacres, slaughters of Armenians, etc. And we have at least this one article where Europe is blaming the Sultan for as you see, it says Armenian, people with bayonets firing at someone. And Europeans who, of course, are guilty of nothing, who are blaming the Turks for their stance on the killing of Armenians. As the war started in 1914, this prescient cartoon was printed in the New York World, I think it's called. I can't remember, but it was also printed in the Globe. A lot of these were printed in, like I said, in London and Canada, or in the U.S. and Canada. This is a person. It says Turkey across his chest, and it was just when Turkey entered the war. So when Turkey entered the war, this cartoon says, "I too must do something for culture," showing somebody sharpening their knives. This was 6 months before the genocide. So 6 months before the genocide, somebody, the cartoonist who won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, I forget his name, it's in the book anyway, kind of foresaw that something like a big slaughter was about to happen. During the war, now I mentioned this earlier, I believe, but this was a Canadian effort. There weren't that many Armenians living in Canada. There were perhaps, at the time of the genocide, about 1,500 Armenians, of which at least half had arrived to work in the 1890s, to work in the Ontario big factories. So there weren't that many, yet there were about 100 of these individuals who joined the Canadian forces, of which we have one person here. His name is Sami Chichetyan, who's from Brantford, and the poor guy was shot just about a month before the end of the war in 1918. So indication of Armenians being involved during the war. An example of a poster that's available at the Archives, Library and Archives Canada. It's a British poster, but I'm assuming if it was there, I'm not sure, but it may very well have been reused in Canada here. There were also other posters, American posters and such, being used to, what is this for? I forget. Yeah, but basically for fundraising efforts at the time. If anyone's aware of UNICEF boxes, some of you might have seen it, just little boxes to put money in. At the time, we had these tin cans with a little slot in it to put money in Canada. That was distributed across the country. Really interesting is the fact that Sunday school children in Canada between 1918 and 1920 collected $300,000 for Armenian relief just with these cans. It's pretty impressive. And the picture you see here, I found an article in the Globe where we take the same picture, and it's Shushan, and her story is indicated, what she lived through or what she barely survived through. So the picture was reused several times. We see it over here as well, that I found, again, for the fundraising efforts. Also, we would do things, I don't know what a tag day is per se, but I think people would get tags when they donated money or something like that. So there was a tag day for Armenian relief, there was a British Empire pageant for Armenian relief. This is all around 1917, 1918. And other posters that appeared in the newspapers. So, this one's really interesting. Just when Turkey left the war, 2 days later, this appeared in the Globe. Basically, the ad here, and I'm saying ad because it's an ad, I'll tell you in a second of what, shows Turkey that just left the Kaiser and didn't want to fight anymore. But it's an ad for Gillette razors. And what it says is, the men who swear by the beard of the prophet lay down their arms to the men who swear by a real shave. So they're trying to use the Armenian issue, well, not the Armenian issue exclusively, but it does refer to the massacre of Turks, to sell their razors. Aurora Mardiganyan's story, some of you have no doubt heard of if you heard of the movie Auction of Souls or Ravaged Armenia. It was a major motion picture that was released in 1919. And this motion picture, as far as I know, the first one that was released on the genocide, the actress is the person whose life the story is about. She acted her own role. It's really sad. I mean, this person was saved. She was bought for $1 back from the harem where she was. A lot of these Armenian children who survived in 1918, they survived in Turkey because some very nice and generous Turks and Kurds took them in. In some cases, not necessarily nice, and in a lot of other cases, the prettiest girls were taken and, in harems. And her story is one of these. So she was bought back for $1 from the missionary I told you about earlier, Frederick McCallum. He saved her life, and he brought her back here, and her story was made into a motion picture. Before it was made into a motion picture, though, the Hearst Corporation in the United States serialized and her story in, I think it was 14 separate one-page chapters of her life. And then these were all taken and a book was published, and the movie was based on the book, all about 1918, 1919, all of which collected tens of millions of dollars for Armenian relief in the United States and abroad. The story that interests us, this is in the Winnipeg Tribune. So the Winnipeg Tribune bought the rights from the Hearst Corporation to give Aurora Mardiganyan's story. And so we have 14 stories. I haven't seen the original Hearst Corporation articles, but so I'm not sure who did it, but everyone is illustrated. Like a lot of different illustrations like these ones. I didn't have enough space for the book, otherwise I put them all, but each one has a different, very, very powerful illustration that shows what her life was like. So, anyhow, the movie was, I don't know about the rest of Canada, because as I said, I haven't done too much research, but in Toronto, 100,000 people went to see it. And there were lines around the blocks, and they kept delaying. They were going to show it for 3 days, then it became a week, then 2 weeks, then in the end they showed it for a month, and then the film was brought back again. It's that first month that 100,000 people in Toronto saw it. I even found, there's a small town, Galt, Manitoba, I found an ad for Auction of Souls. I'm sure this movie was shown in a lot of places in Canada and money was raised for this. So that's one of the extra research that people could do to find out more about it. Anyway, it was shown at the Strand Theatre, which I was lucky enough to find a photograph of online. It closed down that year, in 1920 actually. So it was shown there and abroad. This happened in 1919, and this, I believe, is one of the reasons why in 1920, when I told you chapters 4 to 6, it's all about 1920, this and other things gave people a lot of sympathy for the Armenian people. Also, the war was just over, and treaties were being signed with first the Germans and then the Turks. So when the, what was it? It was still the Ottoman Empire, I suppose, in 1920. Yes, one other person I'll mention is Pierce. This Pierce was one of those eyewitnesses I told you about. His story, the article of the story of his life is printed in the book. I wanted that article to be there. So he survived in 1915. He saw people, he was in Harput, one of the worst affected areas where basically everyone was killed. There was blood everywhere, rivers were running red, it was horrible. And he and his family were there for several weeks, and they were eyewitnesses to this before he was imprisoned and sent to Lebanese jail. And then he came back to Canada. And when he was back in Canada, he went from church to church in Toronto. He was on a feverish mission to talk about this, what he had witnessed. So, anyhow, moving right along, this is the chapter that the title of my book gets its name from. The Call from Armenia was launched by the Globe. The Globe newspaper devoted on its front page a space, a little box, in which they would write the Call from Armenia. This is an example of one. This would be underneath. So say in newspapers like this, there was a box like this, the Call from Armenia, and information in it. This was January 9, 1920. Every day for the next 3 months, they had that box, and they were talking about what was happening to the Armenians. Like I said, this was just before, at San Remo, there was a Turkish... there was going to be the signing of the treaty, the peace treaty with Turkey. So Canadians were super interested, and it's because of what I showed you before, I believe, that this interest existed in Canada. Every time there was, I added this one because a 7-year-old is giving 65 cents from his what's it called, piggy bank to the Armenian kiddies, just to give an idea of what kind of, they were pulling at heartstrings usually when they were running and stuff. Inside, usually every donation was acknowledged. So all of these are all names of people and how much they donated. So all of it was indicated usually on page 4 or 5 in the Globe. John Vengau, who I mentioned earlier, the caricaturist, an example of one of, I think, 4 poems he wrote. And I found about 30 poems, by the way, that Canadians wrote at the time that were published in newspapers or magazines. The money that was collected here by the Globe was pretty phenomenal. In 3 months, they collected $300,000. And that $300,000, missionaries on the field. They were McNaughton, McCallum, who we told you about, he's the one who saved Aurora Mardiganian's life. Nesbitt, William Chambers, he's one of the 2 brothers I showed you earlier, and there was a 4th one, McLaughlin. And they would distribute the money thereafter. The money was enough at this time for, I can't remember, the New York Times, I think, to mention that Canada's doing more than anyone at this point, and the Globe's particularly for Armenian relief. The money was used to buy this building over here. I was very fortunate to have a friend from Istanbul send me a picture of this and say, "Is this the hospital you're looking for?" When I was trying to find it. I didn't find it when I had written my thesis, so I'm very happy about this. All I had was this to go on. And they called it the Canadian Hospital. It was inaugurated on Canada Day, on July 1st, 1920. And Canadians were proud of the fact that not only were orphans being treated here, but also the British and Turks and everyone else. It was called the Hospital for Armenian Tubercular Children, but it was referred to as the Canadian Hospital. There's no information now about what this building is for. It is right now, I forget the name right now, but it's Chest Disease Hospital. So Tubercular Children Hospital, Chest Disease Hospital. The idea remains, but no information about what it had been once upon a time. More information about the Canadian Hospital. Okay, so that was historical context. my fourth chapter, I'm not going to dwell on it too much. Like I said, hundreds of churches wrote to the Canadian government because they weren't happy about what was happening to the Armenian people, and they wanted the Canadian government to do something about it during those peace treaty negotiations. I have examples of the letters they wrote. This is from the Toronto Methodist Minister Association. I think 4 or 5 of these exist in the archives. So, so I put them in there at the back. Every letter that the Canadian government received, there was a list. Like I said, there were about 400. I just gave an example of 1 page, and this is usually what one of the letters would look like. Just to give an idea, this one is from Outremont, Montreal. Put it there because I lived in Outremont in Montreal once upon a time. That one in particular. So, so anyway, it was an interesting lobbying effort that, I don't know how much lobbying efforts there were at this time. But nevertheless, it got the government's attention, and particularly one person in government, the Secretary of State for External Affairs, Newton Rowell. This is him. He was, Robert Borden was Prime Minister. If you look at your $100 bill, his face is Robert Borden. And he was the external, he was called Under Secretary of State for External Affairs, but they were basically in charge of Canada's external affairs. There was not much external affairs in Canada in 1920, and before that, hardly any, because the UK did all of the dominions, all of their external affairs were done by other countries. But Canada, as we have likely heard during the First World War, you hear about it everywhere, Vimy Ridge, and how Canada exploded as a nation and became more confident, and they believed they were a higher power now, a higher world power, and they wanted to be treated as such. It's very interesting how this Armenian case blends into this, because they use the Armenian case to push for better recognition and understanding of what was happening to the Armenians. I have that information in the book. He was the main one who got this going. What's interesting, and in the archive, so record that's printed in the book, was a 5-page letter he wrote February 20, 1920, when all of this was going on once again, where he specifically states in his letter, recalling how these massacres happened, etc. But what's really interesting to me is how he suggests that the Canadian government place itself on record as absolutely opposed to the return of any of the Armenian provinces of Turkey to Turkish rule, and that this view should be communicated at once to His Majesty's government. This and other statements, the Canadian people believe that this should not happen, is, I think, a very powerful statement and gives an idea of how the Canadian government, what the Canadian government thought about this time. Now, he was no longer in power about 4 months later, nor was Borden, because after the war, basically the government that was there, it was called the Union government, a coalition government of liberals and, well, it's called, I don't know if it's a coalition, but it's pro-war liberals and conservatives. And it basically fell apart. So, this is the kind of stuff in 2005 when I was looking at these papers in the archives. I couldn't make any sense of all of this. I mean, I'm glad it's all together now, but I had jumbled information and it was kind of hard to make sense of it. This is an example of one of the, it's just kind of cool to see a cable with all of the code words on it. This is how communication went back and forth. So I included a part of it in the book. So yeah, the fact that the Canadian government was interested in this was likely why there was talk about the Armenian Mandate in Canada. Now let me explain very briefly what a mandate is. Lebanon was a mandated territory, Syria, Palestine was supposed to be, other countries in Africa. These were all places where the Allied victors went and basically got pieces of, and they were the mandatory power, so they would let these countries become independent. Now, we've all heard of all the problems this has caused in the world thereafter, but the one mandate that never went through was the Armenian Mandate. The country everybody wanted to take the Armenian Mandate was the United States. But the United States, with a very willing president, was blocked by Congress. Congress did not want the United States to go there. They sent 2 fact-finding missions there to see what was happening and estimated the cost to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars and in need of 60,000 soldiers. And this was after the war, when people were, especially in Canada and the United States at least, were becoming a little more isolated from these European entanglements and didn't necessarily want to go there. Woodrow Wilson did, the US president, yet they didn't. Now when they did it, when they weren't interested, the powers that be, the Allied powers who were thinking about the Turkish treaty, were looking for another country to take this over. They thought of Holland, they offered it to Holland, Holland rejected, Sweden, etc., and Canada. So the Canadian one I found particularly interesting, of course, but mainly because this gentleman who wrote an article in a very reputable magazine at the time, it was called University Magazine, published at Lyon. His article suggested Canada take the mandate for a variety of reasons. Henry Forbes Angus was an economist, and he, University of British Columbia has a building, this building, it's called the Angus Building. He never spoke about Armenians afterwards, but just after he graduated, at about the time when all of this was going on, he published this really interesting article, which is this over here. It's Next for Duty. So he does argue that Canada should take the mandate, and the article was referred to in the newspaper several times. The entire article is reprinted in the book at the back. The idea of a mandate, of course, takes soldiers, and you need Canadians who are going to go there and fight for this. So one particular cartoon in the Globe referred to Jack Canuck. Jack Canuck is, you've all heard of Uncle Sam for the United States or John Bull for the British. Well, this was the representation, the handsome mustachioed fella here. Jack Canuck represented what a patriotic Canadian is. This was printed in the Globe in February 25, 1920. If you take my book later on, I found this interesting enough to take a detail from it and place it in a maple leaf on the cover of the book, because I found it was a very telling statement. So this is Jack Canuck, Private Jack Canuck, with his little mustache, protecting Armenia and his two children. By the way, the coloring it was black and white. I had a friend of mine color it. I was thinking of using it as a cover of the book, but anyway, it's good for this presentation. And here it says National Turk Party, bloody knife, and here it says Kurd. So the image portrayed here, yes, there's relief, and we've collected relief all this time, but perhaps this boy is needed along with the relief. Maybe we should be sending soldiers. It's a very powerful statement by the Globe. But as you all know, Armenia basically didn't exist. Western Armenia was absorbed by the new Turkish Republic in 1923, and then in 1920, Eastern Armenia, which is now the Republic of Armenia, was a Soviet state. So as there was no Armenia, there was no way to talk about this. And that's what my 7th chapter looks at. It looks at the winding down of the issue. We still have some Canadians very interested in what's happening to the Armenian people. This is Nurse Emma Wood. She's from Sarnia, Ontario. She had, I'm not sure where I'm assuming ladies, knit these little booties or socks, and she brought them here and gave them, these are all children. This is the Canadian hospital. We saw a picture over here, so they're all there. So they all had these socks from Sarnia sent to them. There was a time in the 1920s, mid-20s, 1922, there was a bit of a competition of who's going to get more relief to the Armenians. There was grain from the prairies, boatloads of grain from Canada that went for Armenian relief as well as money. And there's one interesting item, which is in Canada there were claims of Armenians on the Ottoman Empire for reparations. And I think some money was given to those families in the end, and these are, it's not included in the book, but it was reparations for wartime damages because they were Canadians. So anyhow, I told you earlier to remember that Protestant church that I showed in the beginning. This is an article written by Salem Bland. Salem Bland was one of the people who established what is now the NDP. It was the CCF in Ontario. He was one of the greater thinkers of his time. And he also, I believe, the Churches United, Protestant churches in Canada in 1925. So he was one of those people who helped the United Church go along. Apart from lambasting the Christian nations for not doing more for Armenia, he said hopefully Canada will not be part of these groups. He said he reverently cherishes a coin picked out of the ashes of a church in Urfa. I'm not sure where he got it from. Where on December 29, 1895, 600 Armenian men, women, and children were burned alive. So that was the church we saw earlier. And it was interesting to make that connection. And he says, are we to be responsible for new Urfast for years to come? This is one of the last things I'd like to talk about. I didn't go much past 1923 in my research, but this woman is the daughter of the missionary Frederick McCallum, the one who saved Aurora's life. They had 5 kids. He and his wife Mima, I think she's called, and Elizabeth was the middle daughter. She went on to be Canada's first chargée d'affaires, female chargée d'affaires, and it was of Beirut in 1954. A legacy partly of why this person would choose to go into foreign affairs can very well be her upbringing, although I saw no clear connection. But a lot of Mish kids, at least this is the case for Asian countries, Canadians who went to Asian countries as missionaries, often these Mish kids would work in the Foreign Affairs Department. They were really interested in world affairs, and she happens to be one of them. I'll leave you with a final thought here. This is about, I guess, a decade and a half later, 1933. Hitler just came to power, democratically. If you don't know, in the beginning, Hitler was elected to power. So after he was elected, his government started passing anti-Semitic legislation, slowly, in the beginning. And this is about 2 months after the passage of, after Hitler came to power, 2 or 3 months. And here's what prescient editor of a Canadian magazine, the Canadian Baptist, had to say. The entire world is horrified by the tales of barbarism. It is like reading the story of the Armenian massacres again. And one did not expect much better from the Turks, but Germany, the birthplace of Protestantism, is on a different plane surely. So I found this to be a very interesting thing to say 7 years before the Holocaust began. Every place that I've presented, every other place that I've presented, I wanted to have a little local story. Now here in Ottawa, everything in Chapter 5, it's all Ottawa, of course, because it's all the Foreign Affairs Department. There's one thing that I'll mention, apart from that, and the letter is printed in an annex in a book. It's the Bishop of Ottawa, Charles Roper. He was approached on February 15th, 1920. These lobbying churches, what they wanted to do is they wanted to have a day of indignation, it was called. So they wanted to do fundraising efforts, but also to show how they found very undignified and abhorrent what was happening to the Armenian people. But Canadians who believed this was anti-British and anti-imperial in terms of sentiment weren't sure what they should do with this. So the superintendent of the Methodist Church, Samuel Chown, his name is, asked the Bishop of Ottawa, what is Ottawa's sense on this? Can we do these protests? Is it okay? It's really interesting to see this kind of, the way foreign affairs might have been handled at the time. They went through the churches. They asked the bishop to actually find out if the government was okay. So the bishop asked let's say the second in command of Canada, Borden was away. His name is George Foster. Is it okay that we're doing this? And Foster said, yeah, no problem. Of course, we're all shocked at what's happening, and the Canadian government is also making its remonstrations to the British government as well. That's it for my presentation. I'd like to make a couple of concluding comments. Regrettably, I love doing this historical work, but any historian of the Armenian genocide needs to kind of step out of their historian role for a second and be an activist, because as you may know or you may not know, I'm not sure, the Armenian genocide is actively denied. I'm very happy that at least this research puts some of that information in its proper place, at least when it comes to Canada. What happened was, during the 1930s, the only thing that a lot of Canadians would know about Armenians is the starving Armenians. I don't know if any people here have grandparents who would say, oh yeah, I remember the starving Armenians. Well, it was because of those UNICEF box campaigns and everything like that they lived through in the 1930s and 40s. So memories fade, and basically, I mean, right now in Canada, and Ottawa's a hotbed of this, a month ago, there was a film screened on how Armenians lie about the genocide at the Centerpoint Theatre. And this kind of denial happens regularly about the Armenian genocide. And taking advantage of these fading memories over time was the Turkish Republic. What the country basically did was avoid the topic completely in the beginning. And as families of the Armenian survivors in the 1950s and 60s, they were pulling up their bootstraps, thinking of doing something about recognition of the Armenian genocide. and some cases assassinating diplomats as well, which happened in the 80s. But what happened at that time, and there was a coup d'etat in Turkey in 1980, there was a state-sponsored arm that was specifically tasked with coming out with denial ideas. And they would publish books, and they would they changed the teaching in high schools in Turkey, and they taught kids that this never happened. And there was active, it wasn't just denying at this point, it was re-educating the population that there was no such thing as genocide. I'd like to bring up a Canadian example of something like this, the Canadian residential school system, which we all hear about right now, right? It was seen once upon a time as normal. It was seen, people wouldn't think of the ramifications to indigenous peoples when they were taken out of their families and made to think a different way, or made to act a different way, or speak a different language. So I'd like to ask people who are here to just think about that for a moment. Imagine if we're telling you that that's not true. No such system existed in Canada, or they deserved it, or the numbers, it's crazy. It's not really that many people. There are always two sides of the story, which you always hear. Historians and Armenians face this when it comes to the Armenian genocide. It's really unfortunate. I'm very happy that Turkish civil society, in the last 15 years at least, talks about the genocide much more actively. At least they did until relatively recently, when you might get jailed for doing this, but nevertheless, it's really heartening for me to see that this kind of understanding of Turkish history is happening. So, I do hope that this uniquely Canadian perspective adds to the historical scholarship. I do hope it stymies efforts to deny the genocide, and I do hope that you enjoyed hearing about this. Thank you very much. Should I take questions?
You should stay, I think, and take questions, of
Yeah.
course.
Say about 10 minutes for questions? Yes.
I'm also very happy that we have amongst us today members of the Turkish and Kurdish community of Ottawa who also wanted to join us on this, and I would like to
Yes. Thank you. Questions, anyone?
Aram, do you have enough material to write another book?
I don't know, but at this point, I'm happy with this one. I don't know where I'd go from here on in. I mean, there is some more research to do. I guess I'll see where the chips fall in a couple of years. Yeah. Yes.
We are very proud of you, Aram. This is a gigantic work that you have done. In the beginning, you mentioned that there were 300,000 people massacred in 1890s. And in my opinion, maybe it's the time now to evaluate the date of our genocide instead of being 1915, going back to 1890, because that's when, even prior to that, there was segregation, partial massacres, and so on. But the main massacres started in 1890 with 300,000, and then 30,000, and then another 20,000. And then it culminated in 1915, 1.5 million, and up until now, it continues with cultural genocide, with denial. So maybe it's about time for our politicians and historians to backdate the genocide date instead of being 1915, being 1890.
Well,
What do you think
I'll
about
leave the historians who deal with this decide that, but in my opinion, different perpetrators. You had the Sultan who perpetrated the massacres in the 1890s. Then again, you had different perpetrators between 1915 and 1923. In 1915, it was the İttihat ve Terakki group, the extremists of the Young Turks who had planned it. And by 1918 or so, past 1919, a lot of these isolated pogroms were done by the Turkish nationalist forces. So, yeah, I wouldn't. But there's no reason why you can't mention that there were, anybody can't mention that apart from the genocide, there were such things.
May I comment? I stood up specifically, and I'm very sorry, but As a historian who's studying Yerevan State, I wanted to answer Moses' question because in Armenia, in historical science, we did divide the history of genocide in Armenia already. It has been done, and it has been done into 3 periods. So genocidology or genocidologists, already divided in 3 periods. And the first one is the relocation of Armenians by Shah Abbas. That is the first period. Second is Hamidian massacres, and third, Metzierer, a big genocide. So historically, and from the point of view of science, it has been done already in Armenia. Probably outside of Armenia, maybe it's not as known as it is in Armenia, but all history books in Armenia has divided that way ago.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, it's fine. It's better than what I said. Yes. Anybody else?
Was there any reaction by Canadians to the massacres in 1920 in Western Turkey?
Yes. In fact, each time there were continued fundraisings in the 1920s, they would refer to the massacre specifically of Cilicia, for example, in March 1920 or in 1922, just before Smyrna. There were mentions of that. Yes, definitely. Yes.
And also, it seems to me the Armenian genocide took place right around the same time that Britons were invading the Ottoman Empire to create what is now the Arabian states. Do you think it's possible that they may have, the government of the Turkish or the Ottoman Empire used that invasion as a distraction?
Well, the invasion of the Arabic states, that was later on, I think. That was in 1919, I believe. It was a bit later. Yeah, so I don't think that was necessarily mentioned. Yes? Go ahead.
At the time there were Armenian genocide, of course, but there were also Assyrians
Yes.
and also Pontic Greeks and so on. Is there anything written about them in there?
I can't recall.
Why would they focus on Armenians as opposed to Assyrians, for example?
Well, Armenians were internationally known at least, and in Canada the word Armenian was very well known, so I'm not surprised. And number-wise, there was a larger number of Armenians who were killed. But to be quite frank, when I was looking at these 2005, 2006, I collected over 1,000 articles just in 1915 in Canadian articles. I skimmed most of them. It's possible I saw some information, but I can't remember. But there was nothing big. There was nothing.
Yeah.
Usually they weren't mentioned alongside others.
Actually, many of the articles in your book say Christians, not simply Armenians.
That's true. They did, and that's, in my opinion, because they wanted to speak to the Canadian people that these are Christians that are being massacred. But invariably, in the article would be written Armenian, I think. If you, yeah.
Could it also be that because the massacres were happening in an area which was known as historic as Armenia, not Assyria or Greece, basically, rather Western Armenia, so that they associated it with, like from that region to Armenia.
It's possible. It's possible. The genocide was known about as it was happening mainly because there were American missionaries there witnessing it, writing to the world media about what was happening. And I don't think, would mention necessarily Assyrians, and most of them, I think, were, they might have, I can't remember, but definitely the word Armenian rang a bell for a lot of people in the world who had heard about the Hamidian massacres as well. Yes? Go ahead.
Oh, I forget the name of the researcher now. There's an American researcher recently published a book. I have the name at my office. He said he's proven with enough documentation in Zionist strategies that in order to create chaos in the Arabian area so that they can create Israel,